Book 3, Chapter 18 of Robert Falconer, by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Robert Falconer by George MacDonald. Chapter 18. 3 Generations. The next week I went back to my work, leaving the father and son alone together. Before I left I could see plainly enough that the bonds were being drawn closer between them. A whole month passed before they returned to London. The winter then had set in with unusual severity, but it seemed to bring only health to the two men. When I saw Andrew next, there was certainly a marked change upon him. Light had banished the haziness from his eye, and his step was a good deal firmer. I can hardly speak of more than the physical improvement, for I saw very little of him now. Still, I did think I could perceive more of judgment in his face, as if he sometimes weighed things in his mind. But it was plain that Robert continued very careful not to let him a moment out of his knowledge. He busied him with the various sights of London, for Andrew, although he knew all its miseries well, had never yet been inside Westminster Abbey. If he could only trust him enough to get him something to do. But what was he fit for? To try him, he proposed once that he should write some account of what he had seen and learned in his wanderings, but the evident distress with which he shrunk from the proposal was grateful to the eyes and heart of his son. It was almost the end of the year when a letter arrived from John Lammy, informing Robert that his grandmother had caught a violent cold, and that although the special symptoms had disappeared, it was evident her strength was sinking fast, and that she would not recover. He read the letter to his father. "We must go and see her, Robert, my boy," said Andrew. It was the first time that he had shown the smallest desire to visit her. Falconer rose with glad heart, and proceeded at once to make arrangements for their journey. It was a cold, powdery afternoon in January, with the snow thick on the ground, save where the little winds had blown the crown of the street bare before Mrs. Falconer's house. A post-chaise with 4 horses swept wearily round the corner, and pulled up at her door. Betty opened it, and revealed an old withered face, very sorrowful and yet expectant. Falconer's feeling I dare not, Andrew's I cannot, attempt to describe, as they stepped from the chaise and entered. Betty led the way without a word into the little parlour. Robert went next with long quiet strides, and Andrew followed with grey bowed head. Granny was not in her chair. The doors which during the day concealed the bed in which she slept were open, and there lay the aged woman with her eyes closed. The room was as it had always been, only there seemed a filmy shadow in it that had not been there before. "She's deein', sir," whispered Betty. "Ay, is she? Och hon!" Robert took his father's hand and led him towards the bed. They drew nigh softly, and bent over the withered, but not even yet very wrinkled face. The smooth white soft hands lay on the sheet, which was folded back over her bosom. She was asleep, or rather she slumbered. But the soul of the child began to grow in the withered heart of the old man as he regarded his older mother, and as it grew it forced the tears to his eyes, and the word to his lips. "Mother," he said, and her eyelids rose at once. He stooped to kiss her, with the tears rolling down his face. The light of heaven broke and flashed from her aged countenance. She lifted her weak hands, took his head, and held it to her bosom. "Eh, the bonny grey head," she said, and burst into a passion of weeping. She had kept some tears for the last. Now she would spend all that her griefs had left her. But there came a pause in her sobs, though not in her weeping, and then she spoke. "I knew it all the time, O Lord, I knew it all the time. He's come home. My Andrew, my Andrew. I'm as happy as a bairn. O Lord, O Lord." And she burst again into sobs, and entered paradise in radiant weeping. Her hand sank away from his head, and when her son gazed in her face, he saw that she was dead. She had never looked at Robert. The two men turned towards each other. Robert put out his arms. His father laid his head on his bosom, and went on weeping. Robert held him to his heart. When shall a man dare to say that God has done all he can? End chapter 18. Book 3, Chapter 19 of Robert Falconer, by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Robert Falconer by George MacDonald. Chapter 19. The Whole Story. The men laid their mother's body with those of the generations that had gone before her beneath the long grass in their country churchyard near Rothieden. A dreary place, one accustomed to trim cemeteries and sentimental wreaths would call it, to Falconer's mind so friendly to the forsaken dust, because it lapped it in sweet oblivion. They returned to the dreary house, and after a simple meal such as both had used to partake of in their boyhood, they sat by the fire. Andrew in his mother's chair, Robert in the same chair in which he had learned his Sallust and written his versions. Andrew sat for a while gazing into the fire, and Robert sat watching his face, where in the last few months a little feeble fatherhood had begun to dawn. It was their father that Granny used to sit every day, sometimes looking in the fire for hours, thinking about you, I know, Robert said at length. Andrew stirred uneasily in his chair. How do you know that? He asked. If there was one thing I could be sure of, it was when Granny was thinking about you, father. Who wouldn't have known it, father, when her lips were pressed together as if she had some dreadful pain to bear, and her eyes were looking away through the fire, so far away, and I would speak to her 3 times before she would answer. She lived only to think about God and you, father. God and you came very close together in her mind. Since ever I can remember almost, the thought of you was just the one thing in this house. Then Robert began at the beginning of his memory, and told his father all that he could remember. When he came to speak about his solitary musings in the garret, he said, and long before he reached this part he had relapsed into his mother tongue, "Come and look at the place, father. I want to see it again myself." He rose. His father yielded and followed him. Robert got a candle in the kitchen, and the 2 big men climbed the little narrow stair and stood in the little sky of the house, where their heads almost touched the ceiling. "I sat upon the floor there," said Robert, and thought what I would do to get ye, father, and what I would do with ye when I had gotten ye. I would great whiles cause other laddies had a father, and I had none. And there's where I found mamma's box with the letter in it, her own picker. Granny gave me that one of you, and there's where I used to kneel doon and pray to God. And he's heard my prayers and Granny's prayers, and here ye are with me at last. Instead of thinking aboot ye, I have your own self. Come, father, I want to say a word of thanks to God for hearing my prayer." He took the old man's hand, led him to the bedside, and kneeled with him there. My reader can hardly avoid thinking it was a poor sad triumph that Robert had after all. How the dreams of the boy had dwindled in settling down into the reality. He had his father, it was true, but what a father! And how little he had him. But this was not the end, and Robert always believed that the end must be the greater in proportion to the distance it was removed, to give time for its true fulfilment. And when he prayed aloud beside his father, I doubt not that his thanksgiving and his hope were equal. The prayer over, he took his father's hand and led him down again to the little parlour, and they took their seats again by the fire, and Robert began again and again, and went on with his story, not omitting the parts belonging to Mary St. John and Eric Ericson. When he came to tell how he had encountered him in the deserted factory, "Look here, father, here's the mark of the cut," he said, parting the thick hair on the top of his head. His father hid his face in his hands. "It wasna muckle of a blow that ye gied me, father," he went on, "but I fell against the grate, and that was what did it. And I never tellt onybody, nae even Miss St. John, who plastered it up who I had gotten it. And I did not mean to say onything aboot it, but I wanted to tell you a queer dream, such a queer dream it garred me dream this same night." As he told the dream, his father suddenly grew attentive, and before he had finished looked almost scared, but he said nothing. When he came to relate his grandmother's behaviour after having discovered that the papers relating to the factory were gone, he hid his face in his hands once more. He told him how Granny had mourned and wept over him, from the time when he heard her praying aloud as he crept through her room at night to their last talk together after Dr. Anderson's death. He set forth as he could in the simplest language the agony of her soul over her lost son. He told him then about Ericson and Dr. Anderson, and how good they had been to him. At last, of Dr. Anderson's request that he would do something for him in India. "Will you go on with me, father?" he asked. "I'll never leave you again, Robert, my boy," he answered. "I have been a bad man and a bad father, and now I give myself up to you to make the best of me ye can. I dare not leave ye, Robert." "Pray to God to take care of ye, father. He'll do onything for ye if you'll only let him." "I will, Robert." "I was myself dreadful miserable for a while," Robert resumed, "for I could not see or hear God at all, but God heard me, and loot me ken that he was there, and that all was right. I was just like when a barnie wakens up and cries oot, thinking it's alone, and through the mirk comes the word of the mother of it, saying, 'I'm here, cratur, dinna greit.' And I came to believe 'at he would make you a good man at last. Oh, father, it's been my dream walking and sleeping to have ye back to me and grannie and mamma and the Father of us all, and Jesus Christ that's done onything for us. And noo ye maun pray to God, father. Ye will pray to God to hold a grip of ye. Will not ye, father?" I will, Robert. But I've been an awful sinner. I believe I was the death of your mother, laddie." Some fount of memory was opened, some tide of old tenderness gushed up in his heart. At some window of the past the face of his dead wife looked in. The old man broke into a great cry, and sobbed and wept bitterly. Robert said no more, but wept with him. Henceforward the father clung to his son like a child. The heart of Falconer turned to his Father in heaven with speechless thanksgiving. The ideal of his dream was beginning to dawn, and his life was new born. It did not take Robert long to arrange his grandmother's little affairs. He had already made up his mind about her house and furniture. He rang the bell one morning for Betty. "Have ye ony siller laid up, Betty?" "Ay, I have £15 in the savings bank." "And what do you think of doing?" "I'll get a bit roomy and take in washing." "Weel, I'll tell you what I would like you to do. You know Mistress Elshender?" "Fine that, and a very decent body she is." "Well, if ye like, ye can haud this hoose and all 'at's in it, just as it is till the day of your death, and ye'll aye keep it in order, and the gel room ready for me at ony time I may happen to come in upon ye in want of a night's quarters. But I would like ye, if ye have nae objections, to take Mistress Elshender to bide with ye. She's turnin' some frail noo, and I'm under a great obligation to her Sandy, ye know." "Ay, well that. He learnt ye to fiddle, Robert. I humbly beg your pardon, sir, Mr. Robert." "Nae offence, Betty, I assure you. Ye have been aye good to me, and I thank ye heartily." Betty could not stand this. Her apron went up to her eyes. "Eh, sir," she sobbed, "ye was aye a good lad." "Except when I spake of Muckledrum, Betty." She laughed and sobbed together. "Weel, ye'll take Mistress Elshender in, will not ye?" "I'll do that, sir, and I'll try to do my best with her." "She can help ye, you know, with your washing and sich like. She's a hard working woman, sir. She would do that weel. And when you're in ony want of siller, just write to me. And if onything should happen to me, you know, write to Mr. Gordon, a friend of mine. There's his address in Lonnon." "Eh, sir, but ye are kind. God bless you for all." She could bear no more, and left the room crying. Everything settled at Rothieden, he returned to Bodyfall. The most welcome greeting he had ever received in his life lay in the shine of his father's eyes when he entered the room where he sat with Miss Lammie. The next day they left for London. Chapter 19. Book 3, Chapter 20 of Robert Falconer, by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Robert Falconer, by George MacDonald. Chapter 20. The Vanishing. They came to see me the very evening of their arrival. As to Andrew's progress there could be no longer any doubt. All that was necessary for conviction on the point was to have seen him before and to see him now. The very grasp of his hand was changed. But not yet would Robert leave him alone. It will naturally occur to my reader that his goodness was not much yet. It was not. It may have been greater than we could be sure of, though. But if any one object that such a conversion, even if it were perfected, was poor inasmuch as the man's free will was intromitted with, I answer, the development of the free will was the one object. Hitherto it was not free. I ask the man who says so, where would your free will have been if at some period of your life you could have had everything you wanted? If he says it is nobler in a man to do with less help, I answer, Andrew was not noble. Was he therefore to be forsaken? The prodigal was not left without the help of the swine and their husks at once to keep him alive and disgust him with the life. Is the less help a man has from God the better? According to you, the grandest thing of all would be for a man sunk in the absolute abysses of sensuality, all at once to resolve to be pure as the Empyrean, and be so, without help from God or man. But is the thing possible? As well might a hyena say, I will be a man, and become one. That would be to create. Andrew must be kept from the evil long enough to let him at least see the good before he was let alone. But when would we be let alone? For a man to be fit to be let alone is for a man not to need God, but to be able to live without him. Our hearts cry out, to have God is to live. We want God. Without him no life of ours is worth living. We are not then even human, for that is but the lower form of the divine. We are immortal, eternal. Fill us, O Father, with thyself. Then only all is well. More. I heartily believe, though I cannot understand the boundaries of will and inspiration, that what God will do for us at last is infinitely beyond any greatness we could gain, even if we could will ourselves from the lowest we could be into the highest we can imagine. It is essential divine life we want, and there is grand truth, however incomplete or perverted, in the aspiration of the Brahmin. He is wrong, but he wants something right. If the man had the power in his pollution to will himself into the right without God, the fact that he was in that pollution with such power must damn him there forever. And if God must help ere a man can be saved, can the help of man go too far towards the same end? Let God solve the mystery, for he made it. One thing is sure, we are his, and he will do his part, which is no part but the all in all. If man could do what in his wildest self-worship he can imagine, the grand result would be that he would be his own God, which is the hell of hells. For some time I had to give Falconer what aid I could in being with his father while he arranged matters in prospect of their voyage to India. Sometimes he took him with him when he went amongst his people, as he called the poor he visited. Sometimes when he wanted to go alone, I was to take him to Miss St. John, who would play and sing as I had never heard any one play or sing before. Andrew on such occasions carried his flute with him, and the result of the two was something exquisite. How Miss St. John did lay herself out to please the old man! And pleased he was. I think her kindness did more than anything else to make him feel like a gentleman again, and in his condition that was much. At length Falconer would sometimes leave him with Miss St. John till he or I should go for him. He knew she could keep him safe. He knew that she would keep him if necessary. One evening I went to see Falconer. I found him alone. It was one of these occasions. "I am very glad you have come, Gordon," he said. "I was wanting to see you. I have got things nearly ready now. Next month, or at latest the one after, we shall sail, and I have some business with you which had better be arranged at once. No one knows what is going to happen. The man who believes the least in chance knows as little as the man who believes in it the most. My will is in the hands of Dobson. I have left you everything." I was dumb. "Have you any objection?" he said, a little anxiously. "Am I able to fulfil the conditions?" I faltered. "I have burdened you with no conditions," he returned. "I don't believe in conditions. I know your heart and mind now. I trust you perfectly." "I am unworthy of it." "That is for me to judge." "Will you have no trustees?" "Not one." "What do you want me to do with your property?" You know well enough. Keep it going the right way. I will always think what you would like. No, do not. Think what is right, and where there is no right or wrong plain in itself, then think what is best. You may see good reason to change some of my plans. You may be wrong, but you must do what you see right, not what I see or might see right. But there is no need to talk so seriously about it, I said. You will manage it yourself for many years yet. Make me your steward, if you like, during your absence. I will not object to that. You do not object to the other, I hope? No. Then so let it be. The other, of course. I have, being a lawyer myself, taken good care not to trust myself only with the arranging of these matters. I think you will find them all right. But supposing you should not return? You have compelled me to make this supposition. Of course, go on. What am I to do with the money in the prospect of following you? Ah, that is the one point on which I want a word, although I do not think it is necessary. I want to entail the property. How? By word of mouth, he answered, laughing. You must look out for a right man, as I have done, get him to know your ways and ideas, and if you find him worthy, that is a grand, wide word. Our Lord gave it to his disciples. Leave it all to him in the same way I have left it to you, trusting to the Spirit of truth that is in him, the Spirit of God. You can copy my will as far as it will apply, for you may have, one way or another, lost the half of it by that time. But by word of mouth you must make the same condition with him as I have made with you, that is, with regard to his leaving it, and the conditions on which he leaves it, adding the words, that it may descend thus in perpetuum. And he must do the same. He broke into a quiet laugh. I knew well enough what he meant, but he added, that means, of course, for as long as there is any. Are you sure you are doing right, Falconer? I said. Quite. It is better to endow one man who will work as the Father works, than 100 charities. But it is time. I went to fetch my father. Will you go with me? This was all that passed between us on the subject, save that on our way he told me to move to his rooms and occupy them until he returned. My papers, he added, I commit to your discretion. On our way back from Queen Square he joked and talked merrily. Andrew joined in. Robert showed himself delighted with every attempt at gaiety or wit that Andrew made. When we reached the house, something that had occurred on the way made him turn to Martin Chuzzlewit, and he read Mrs. Gamp's best to our great enjoyment. I went down with the two to Southampton to see them on board the steamer. I stayed with them there until she sailed. It was a lovely morning in the end of April, when at last I bade them farewell on the quarter-deck. My heart was full. I took his hand and kissed it. He put his arms round me and laid his cheek to mine. I was strong to bear the parting. The great iron steamer went down in the middle of the Atlantic, and I have not yet seen my friend again. The end. End. Chapter 20. End. Robert Falconer by George MacDonald.